The year is 2015. You're with a business where you need to do some pretty serious work with Windows applications, but you don't want to lug around a laptop. What could you buy? While there are options at the low end, they're all too slow for what you need. However, your budget is not very tight, so you can afford to spend $1,000 or two on a machine. The machine you choose is the Dell Venue 11 Pro 7140. It's fast, it's nice, and most importantly, runs Windows with an x86 CPU. Today, we will be reviewing this 2-in-1, not for business applications, but for gaming. Given the fact that this machine is branded under Dell's Venue line, it is first and foremost meant for the business market. However, it wasn't totally out of reach of your prosumer types and even some regular consumers. This configuration more than likely would have cost a bit north of the $1,000 mark, but thinking back to that time, that's really not terrible for what you get. This model here is configured with 8 GB of LPDDR3 RAM, and this chip does in fact have a 2-channel memory controller, which some of their lower-end Atom models didn't have. This machine has the Core M5Y71 at its heart, which is a dual-core chip with hyperthreading. It has a base clock of 1.2 GHz, but the configurable TDP means that the actual base clock here is 1.4 GHz. While the Intel site lists 2.9 GHz as the max turbo speed, that's pie in the sky numbers, and you'll typically see around 2 to 2.3 GHz under a lighter load and 1.9 GHz on sustained all-core load. It has 4 megabytes of cache and just so happens to be 14 nanometer. In fact, Broadwell was Intel's first true go at 14 nanometer. But due to poor yield rates, it took them until Skylake to get good enough yields to market 14 nanometer broadly. The onboard GPU is the Intel HD 5300, which, due to the low max frequency, is more limiting than you would expect. What I find the most impressive part, though, is that this chip has a TDP of only 6 watts, which is crazy efficient, especially for the time. So, it was a groundbreaking chip for the time, particularly in mobile, as you could really only approach 6 watts of power consumption with the older and far slower Atom chips or ARM chips. So with all that out of the way, I do want to say a couple of things about the device itself before we head on to benchmarks. But if you want to skip directly to the benchmarks, you can head to the timestamp on screen now. Due to the whole fact that this is a tablet, almost everything is soldered down, so upgrading is not really a thing. But you can upgrade the SSD on board, and while there is a second, what looks like NVMe slot open, it's actually for an optional 4G card. So, knowing that upgrade options are limited, why don't we take a look at the device physically? The front has the actually still very nice 10.8-inch 1080p IPS touchscreen with a capacitive Windows button, which doesn't make much sense on Windows 10, but with Windows 8.1 being the pre-installed OS of choice, it made more sense at that time. The only two real gripes I have with the screen is that it doesn't get amazingly bright and it is noticeably inaccurate with colors. You also have a somewhat reasonable 2-megapixel front camera with a quite decent 8-megapixel rear camera. On top of the tablet is nothing. So moving on to the right side, you have the power button, SD card slot cover, a speaker, and a Kensington lock. On the left side of it, you have the headphone jack, volume rocker, the other speaker, a micro USB port, a micro HDMI port, and a full-sized USB Type-A port. Take that, ASUS. And on the bottom you have the charging and data port, as well as the docking pins. The speakers are, I would consider, reasonably good for a tablet, so take a listen. While the keyboard is sold separately, I will include it. It clicks together and is decently rigid with a decent amount of play, but nothing uber distracting. An interesting tidbit is that even with the keyboard connected, it doesn't really tip backwards too easily, unlike that ASUS I reviewed previously. The keyboard keys themselves are actually pretty dang good. The travel isn't great, but they do have a nice tactile bump when they bottom out. The keyboard doesn't have any ports on it though, except for a micro USB port to charge it, which I unfortunately don't have the correct charger for, so the battery in the keyboard is not detected, unfortunately. All in all though, the battery has about 4 hours of life, just browsing and watching YouTube, but the keyboard is meant to double that life. Oh, and the trackpad is whatever. It's fine. It's usable. You have a touchscreen. Why are you using a trackpad? Anyways, though, we can now finally see how the heck this thing can game. Righty, so I'm just going to say now that this thing is not really meant for gaming, and this may be a bit jarring to watch for some people, but by golly, we're going to game on it. I can't use the standard benchmark suite, as that is just not happening. I will not subject myself to throw up in VR at 1 FPS. No. So, starting with Minecraft with the Optifine mod, we see decent performance at 57 FPS on average, but with horrendous 1% lows at 23 FPS. However, it did still run good enough for me to forget I was benchmarking, and if I was a kid, I'd be over the moon. Next is Crossout, and it showed that this is quite heavily GPU bottlenecked with 28 FPS on average, and to make it run that well, it ends up looking like a PS2 game, quite honestly. Avorion is next, and it's just dead. It's just starting the game and loading a galaxy takes 2 minutes, and I was seeing 34 FPS in the beginning of the game with a tiny ship, and after a couple of hyperspace jumps, I was no longer to calculate a jump route. Not good! BeamNG Drive, though, performed better than expected, with 17 FPS on average, giving me not a good time on West Coast USA, as it was extremely GPU limited. And no, even with the new traffic update, it's not going to handle more than one car. BioShock provides a nice change of pace with 50 FPS on average and totally acceptable lows, hovering at 24 FPS, and was genuinely quite fun. Next, we have Spintire's Mudrunner, where it once again shows just how far good optimization goes, because I was getting a whopping 31 FPS on average, with pretty acceptable 1% lows, given what this game is, and the game still looked totally fine. Halo Master Chief Collection ran decently with 40 FPS on average, but that was while playing at 320 by 200, which I consider the most you can do due to the horrendous stutters that occur above that resolution. Crash Drive 2 ran great though, at 58 FPS on average, with really good 1% lows. But that's to be expected from a simple 3D title. So, all in all, regular games aren't great on this machine, but simpler 2D games and older games do run just about good enough to be tolerable. And this is all within a 6-watt envelope, mind you. But we aren't done with the benchmarks yet. Something else I wanted to test was just how good streaming from my PC works with the Steam in-home streaming thing to play games on the tablet. To answer that, it worked completely fine, and the experience playing games like that is pretty good, although the poor max brightness can make darker games very hard to play when you have lighting of any sort. So yeah, it isn't incapable of gaming by any stretch. Now though, let's look at some far more reasonable tasks that you'd want to do on a machine like this. In general, YouTube, Twitch, and pretty much any streaming service or site I go to is fast, loads quick, and is completely usable. No complaints. In fact, that's where I see the biggest use for this thing, is the fact that it's a rather nice tablet for not that much money. With pretty good speakers and a good screen, it makes it great for just watching videos on, or heck, even ebooks are completely fine on this machine. Any business applications, of course, will still work fine, such as Google Docs, or pretty much anything you would want to do on this machine within a browser, you can. I think I've said enough about this thing though now, so why don't I give you all my final thoughts on this device. To be completely honest with you, I came into this not expecting it to be able to do all that much, really. I knew that web browsing was going to be fine and all, but when I saw something like MudRunner run as well as it did, that's when I got genuinely surprised and a little excited. This thing could certainly run all games pre-2010, and even some more modern titles, as long as they are either simple 3D titles or 2D ones. As a general media consumption device, it is still fantastic. The only real gripe I have with the device is that there are a lack of USB ports, but that can be solved with a USB hub or the desktop dock that adds a whole bunch of stuff like DisplayPort and Ethernet to this device. If you can pick up one of these Core M models, stray far away from the Atom variants, for under $150, you definitely should pick one up. The 8GB RAM model is obviously the better option, but the 4GB RAM model isn't awful either. But I would be more inclined to run Windows 7 or Linux on a machine like that. Well, that's it. If you wonderful people enjoyed today's video, make sure to like and subscribe and hit that bell icon down below. As always, I do have a Patreon where you can support me and help me continue making videos for this channel. Anyways, DDT out.